My name is Jenny, and I wanted to address some topics about the nature of crisis intervention. I hope that my answers provide more clarity on this topic and urge you to think deeper about something that we all experience to some degree, even multiple times within our life. So I first want to define a crisis. A crisis is any developmental, situational, existential, or ecosystemic situation that causes individual or societal disequilibrium. This can look like many different things. Some crises are more predictable than others, and others are completely uncontrollable. It's important to remember that when working in crisis intervention, that a crisis can be anything. It's subjective to the client, and it's not a matter of whether we think that they're overreacting or that their situation shouldn't cause them this much distress. It matters that they are feeling immobile. They are feeling stuck in the problem, and we are there to help them. Lastly, before I get into the rest of this discussion, I want to note that I understand that it can be a common notion that when we think of the word crisis, we tend to closely associate it with suicide. While most suicide precedes a crisis, absolutely not all crises result in death by suicide. There are resources and help available, and I encourage anybody who is struggling to reach out. Crisis isn't always a situation of life or death, but it can absolutely come down to that without the proper intervention in place. So that does bring me to my next point, which is that there are several differences between counseling and crisis intervention. Some of the applicable and effective techniques in a counseling session could be futile or even counterproductive when addressing an individual in crisis. It is vital to this it is vital that the specialist assesses the individual by body language and other verbal cues to best choose where they should act on the involvement continuum. Fundamentally, crisis work does involve the specialist to be much more directive and assertive, while traditional counseling is usually more collaborative and focused on emphasizing client autonomy. Um, in crisis, the primary task of the specialist is to mitigate the risks with the goal of stabilizing the situation and returning the individual to a state of equilibrium and mobility. Crisis situations require moment-specific approaches and short-term solution-focused behaviors, addressing current concerns rather than diving deep into long-term issues, since individuals in crisis may have trouble processing complex information and forming coherent thoughts and feelings. Um, so ways that the specialist can guide the individual in crisis towards stabilization is by asking them closed-ended rather than open-ended questions. Um, for example, a closed-ended question would be, does that make you feel better? And an open-ended question would be, how does that make you feel? Um, Open-ended questions can require more effort to answer because they demand a more detailed response, potentially increasing stress or confusion. This provides the specialist with an effective way of gathering information clearly and quickly, since time can be a contributing factor, depending how entrenched the individual feels within their crisis. Closed-ended questions also provide the individual less anxiety, because, like I said, their cognition might be impaired due to the overwhelming nature of crisis. So I feel like this is a good time to bring up some fundamental skills and attitudes that specialists should focus on conveying when working with an individual in crisis, as well as working with individuals with PTSD. So first and foremost, crisis and trauma work require the specialist to be comfortable with the expression of emotional pain. The specialist needs to have a clear understanding of the separation between their own life and the crisis that the client is experiencing. The specialist must resolve their own traumas and triggers before attempting to aid another. If they don't, the victim's expression of pain could come across as threatening to the specialist, which obviously creates an issue. Crisis work requires the specialist to express empathy and acceptance to the individual in crisis. The specialist needs to be poised, trustworthy, and non-judgmental, validating without trying to minimize the crisis and the feelings that the situation at hand is evoking in the individual can be very beneficial to them. Helping clients understand that their reaction to traumas and crisis are common responses to abnormal events can reduce feelings of shame and self-blame. Trauma survivors and those in crisis often struggle with feelings unheard and misunderstood. Facilitative listening and as well as reflective listening are important strategies to build trust. And it's also important to pace trauma work according to the victim's readiness to talk about their trauma. Pushing a client to too quickly into traumatic memories or emotions can be detrimental. So gradual exposure and letting the survivor process the trauma at their own pace is the correct approach. Um, Many behaviors such as hypervigilance, dissociation, isolation, aggression can be responses to trauma. Understanding that these reactions in survivors of trauma are likely to be survival mechanisms allows the specialist to be more empathetic and less likely to judge or misinterpret the client's behavior. Something that is crucial to remember in crisis and trauma work and can help specialists target empathy and understanding is that the victim is having or speaking about the worst day of their life, and we must be mindful of that. Another important thing to be mindful of and remember when working with individuals with PTSD is that a lot of times the psychological and physical symptoms of PTSD don't stop the moment the threat is not present. People who have lived through trauma often feel residual effects for years and years, even after the initial experience. Which this brings to mind an article that was featured in the New York Times, um, written by Shandy Brewer, titled "Everyone Thought We Were Going to Die." Essentially, the article profiles and describes passengers and crew members on a flight that experienced extreme turbulence and mechanical difficulties, some being forced to make emergency landings. Each person who was interviewed described a range of difficulties in their daily lives. Even though the flights were a year ago and no one on the flight was killed or seriously injured. So there are a lot of biological happenings that can explain why passengers involved are still struggling with this experience. Um, so when an individual undergoes a traumatic and stressful event, such as a malfunction on an airplane, the brain is highly alert, which is a reflex rooted in the old brain, the part of the brain that is geared toward survival. The memory center of the brain stores memories in a different way than everyday experiences. Um, Triggers related to traumatic memories can trigger a deep emotional and psychological response, similar to what was felt during the event. Um, this process is called heightened emotional recall and memory consolidation. And teaching victims of PTSD can help them understand that this is a biological and normal process for sensory triggers to induce a traumatic response. A trauma response could look like hypervigilance, flashbacks, withdrawal, isolation, aggression, as well as biological symptoms such as increase in heart rate and breathing. In addition to that, the emotional part of the brain is also very activated in times of stress and can cause intense feelings of danger and unsafety, even when the survivor is not facing a present threat. Also to be considered is the fact that living through such threatening situation can leave survivors feeling a heightened sense of vulnerability just in their everyday life, increasing anxiety and hypervigilance that something traumatic could happen at any time. So I really felt that this article speaks to the difficulty that most people face when processing and letting go of emotionally charged experiences like trauma. Um, so that brings me to the last topic that I want to talk about today, which is suicide. I want to note that something that the human services community has agreed upon is to stop saying the word committed when referring to death caused by suicide. And the reason is for this is because saying that somebody committed suicide has a connotation of criminality, kind of like the way we would say somebody has committed a crime. Suicide is not a crime, which is why, when referring to a death caused by suicide, it's more appropriate to phrase the words as died by suicide or even died by mental health. I've heard people say that the words the person lost their battle with mental health, which I find to be one of the most real and authentic interpretations of a death by suicide. So suicide is a worldwide concern. Every year in the United States, approximately 46,000 people die from suicide. Of those 46,000 people, 31% were in contact with a mental health professional within the 12 months prior to their death. So most people who are feeling suicidal show a number of um, signs and symptoms um, of their uh, intentions, but sometimes these warning signs may be veiled, dismissed, or hard for others to recognize as potential indicators of suicide risk. Um, the single-handed largest risk for somebody dying by suicide is a previous suicide attempt. This risk skyrockets if the individual has access to a firearm because death by a self-inflicted gunshot is the most fatalistic and irreversible method of suicide. Um, I remember an acronym from assessing an acronym used for assessing somebody's risk for lethality. It is path warm, I for ideation, S for substance abuse, P for purposelessness, A for agitation or anxiety, T for feeling trapped, H for hopelessness, W for withdrawal, A for anger, R for recklessness, and M for mood fluctuations. Those are behaviors, feelings that can uh, kind of cause red flags to be raised that somebody is at a heightened risk for death by suicide. So while there are those red flags, sometimes somebody at risk for suicide can be tricky to identify because they are not exhibiting those feelings or ideations, or they might not have any other predispositions putting them at a higher risk, such as chronic depression or PTSD. They may seem to have their life in order. They could be mothers, husbands, bosses, teachers. They may seem to pose very little risk to themselves or others, but they should not be weighed out as a potential option to fall victim to suicide. This brings me to my next point. I read the article that brings this concept to life. The article was published last month of this year, November 26th, 2024, in the NC State student paper called The Technician. Um, Professor Marshall Bryan, an author and award-winning faculty member, much beloved by his students, and an influential figure in the world of science and entrepreneurship, died by suicide after an ethical conflict at his workplace. Professor Bryan is survived by his four children and his wife. Um, so one might hear Professor Bryan's story and think, how could such a highly accomplished person who had so much going for him die by suicide over a conflict at work? Um, the fact is that suicide is never the result of only one conflict, but it's a chronic accumulation of multiple factors in an individual's life. Mental health is closely related to suicide as mental illness perpetuates suicidal ideation. Um, Common to all suicides is the individual's sense of per- perturbation and degree of lethality. Um, Dr. Schneidman coined this concept in 1999. Um, he said that perturbation is the degree to which the individual is upset. Perturbation by itself does not lead to suicide. Most of us are upset by events, people, and things a great deal of the time, but we get over being upset. However, when perturbation is combined with how oriented the person is towards death, the lethality level rises, and the person becomes more prone to suicide or homicide. So in Professor Bryan's case, I feel like the intervention that would have made the most difference between Bryan's life or his death would to be if he were asked if he was feeling suicidal. It is a common misconception or myth that discussing suicide with a suicidal individual will move them more towards acting on it. This is not true. We should never shy away from this conversation. Um, Doing so only emphasizes feelings of stigma and isolation, and suicide shouldn't be treated as like a taboo crime. Addressing the risk of suicide in an empathetic way will provide a struggling individual with a sense of relief and, very importantly, time to de escalate these feelings and hopefully evoke a sense of wanting to regain control of their life.